Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Today we have a webinar, and we have HHS joining us as well. So a special welcome to all of you, those of you from HHS. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Ali Iqbal, a colleague of mine, a new colleague of mine who came on as an assistant professor in the Division of Nephrology and is a transplant nephrologist and clinician educator starting in July of last year. So Ali completed his undergraduate in health sciences, his medical school residency and fellowship training at McMaster. And he's privately asked me whether the world ends just beyond Brantford. And I've tried to convince him that in fact it doesn't. He's very interested in e-health and medical education at all levels, and has been involved in the development of our transplant fellowship curriculum, which has been very successful. He's a selected student committee coordinator for nephrology. He's a student advisor for medical students and is on our competency committee. So already very well embedded in our very active and large program, education program here in transplant. Today's going to talk to us about the supply and demand for kidneys, global organ trafficking and transplant abuse, with a particular focus on China. He'll look at the gap between global organ supply and demand, ethical issues pertaining to trafficking, the outcomes, a particular focus on some of the great unpleasantries in China. And then he has a very special guest to introduce to us more towards the end of the talk. So Ali, it is your floor.
Just going to share my slides. Okay. Thanks for the introduction, Alistair, and thanks everyone for joining. It's nice to see everyone. I haven't seen a lot of you in a while, so it's nice to see everyone through Zoom. So today I'll be talking about basically the global organ trafficking industry, and specifically focusing in on transplant abuse in China and forced organ harvesting, which has been happening for years in China. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge and introduce a few people. Honorable David Kilgore, who is with us today. He should be joining shortly. He's an author, lawyer. He was a member of parliament in Southeast Edmonton from 1979 to 2006. He was the Secretary of State for Canada to the Asia Pacific in 2002 and 2003. David has done an amazing, incredible amount of work in the area of forced organ harvesting, among many other areas. But he, in 2006, along with David Matas, were one of the first investigators to put out a report on what's happening in China. And for their work in this area, they were nominated for a Nobel Prize. So really honored to have David with us, and I'm looking forward to have him speak later on in the presentation. David Matas, who, as I mentioned, was part of the Kilgore-Matas report. He's an international human rights lawyer. He was inducted into the Order of Canada. He's an author, and he's done an amazing amount of work in this area as well. Dr. Alia Khan, who many of you know, is a professor of medicine here at McMaster in the Division of Endocrinology. Dr. Irene Turpie is a professor emeritus in the Division of Geriatrics. Dr. Khan and Dr. Turpie are co-chairs of Canadians in Support of Refugees in Dire Need, CSRDN, which is a great organization that does a lot of good work and has done a lot to shed light on this issue and spread awareness on this issue, sending letters to MPs and to organizations such as the Canadian Society of Transplant. So I'd just like to acknowledge them and thank them for being with us today as well. Just an outline of my presentation. So I'll give you a bit of background about renal transplantation. Then we'll get into the global organ supply and demand, which is really driving the organ trafficking industry around the world. Following that, we'll discuss some of the ethical principles involved in organ transplant and how these principles, in organ trafficking come into conflict with some of these ideals that we try to live up to. Then we'll get into some of the outcomes of patients that undergo organ trafficking, both from the donor and recipient side. And I have donor in quotation there because many of these studies refer to people that sell their kidneys into organ trafficking more as kidney vendors or kidney sellers, because donation has the implication that people are donating for altruistic reasons and not selling them into a black market. And the latter part of my presentation, we're going to focus on forced organ harvesting in China. And I want to make a clear distinction between organ trafficking in China and that's going on around the world. China is really in a league of its own in terms of the scale of this practice and also the source of the organs. So China is using organs from executed prisoners of conscience, and they've been doing this for many, many years. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about this topic and what I've learned as a transplant nephrologist about forced organ harvesting. But then more importantly, we're going to have David Kilgore speak, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what we can do about it as well. And I can see that David has joined us, so thank you, David. Sorry, I think you missed your introduction, which was the previous slide, but thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you, Ellie.
Bit of background about renal transplants. So the first renal transplant was done in 1954 on a pair of monozygotic twins, and by the 90s, it became the treatment of choice for most patients with end-stage renal disease. It's been shown to improve survival. By about 18 months post-transplant, patients have a relative risk of death of about 0.3 compared to waitlisted patients. They have an improved quality of life and reduction in overall healthcare costs. Just to give you an idea, in the first year post-transplant, the cost of the healthcare system is about $67,000, which is roughly equivalent to that of a dialysis patient. But by year 2, that price drops off to about $27,000. So substantial reduction in healthcare costs to the system with transplanted patients. And just to give you some global data, according to the WHO, there's 91 countries that perform organ transplants, the majority of which are kidney transplants at 66,000, followed by liver transplants and then heart transplants. The shortage of organs is a universal problem. To give you some Canadian data, in 2019, there are almost 1,800 renal transplants that were done in Canada. There are 3,300 patients on the waiting list, and there's more than 5,800 new dialysis patients. And from 2010 to 2019, over the course of the 9 years, there are 33% increase in ESRD patients. So you can see that the demand for kidneys is increasing because there's an increasing number of patients reaching ESRD, and the wait time for a deceased donor kidney can be up to 6 years. I also want to mention that there's many countries that don't even have an organized deceased donor program. So you can imagine that patients that have to wait 6 years, or if their country doesn't have a deceased donor program, if these patients don't have a willing donor, then they do get quite desperate to get a kidney, and we often see patients advertising and soliciting donors on Facebook, on social media, billboards, and then transplant tourism sometimes happens as well. So in summary, there's been a growing demand for organs because of the aging population, increasing in hypertension, diabetes, and broadened eligibility for transplant. We're transplanting older people, more comorbid people, so there's a growing demand for organs. But unfortunately, the supply hasn't kept up. There's been some increase in deceased donor rates in Western countries in the last 10 years, but not a significant increase in living donor rates. So this widening gap between supply and demand has led to this illicit global organ trafficking industry. And the WHO estimates that up to 10% of transplants are through organ trafficking. And obviously there's many concerns with organ trafficking. Number one, the source of the organs. Is this coming from donors that are paid? Or is this coming from executed donors, like in the situation in China? Many ethical issues to consider, which we'll get into. The health of the donors is a concern, the health of the recipient, and also public health concerns from the perspective of resistant organisms, which have been mentioned in some of the studies. And also transplant tourism, organ trafficking, and commercialization are illegal activities and condemned by medical societies around the world. So where are these kidneys and organs coming from? So this was a study published in AJT in 2008 of American ESRD patients who went abroad to receive a kidney transplant. And you can see the majority, the highest number of patients went to China at 97, followed by Philippines, followed by India, and several other countries you can see there as destination countries for transplant tourism. I just want to show you some websites that are on the internet, or I'm not sure if they're still active, but some examples of websites advertising prices for organs. You can see several websites out of China where they're advertising a kidney for $70,000. If you get the kidney pancreas package, it's $160,000. Some websites from Pakistan, from Philippines, liver4u.org is out of the Philippines. So really a lot of different websites that patients can access to look for organs. And looking at one website out of India, so this is how they're advertising to these potential recipients. In India, it's easy to spot kidney donors and get the transplant done quick. So it's super easy, and you can see how happy these two recipients are, how happy the doctor is. So it really ignores the plight of the donors and the exploitation that happens on the donor side of things to get these people transplants. Just want to go into some of the ethical principles that are involved in organ transplantation and how organ trafficking conflicts with some of these principles. Number one is equity, and some papers refer to this as justice. This is the idea that people should have equitable access to transplant, regardless of their race, religion, socioeconomic status. And it's quite obvious how organ trafficking violates this, because if only the wealthy can purchase kidneys, can afford to buy organs around the world, and it's the poor that are exploited and deceived into selling their kidneys, then systematically you're improving the health of the wealthy and you're worsening the health outcomes of the poor. Autonomy, which basically means that patients should have the ability to make decisions about their health, given that informed consent has occurred. But the issue with organ trafficking is that informed consent is not possible when there's manipulation, when there's the use of deception, exploitation, and in some cases there's no consent at all, like in forced organ harvesting in China. Finally, the utilitarian principle is that we should maximize the net benefit to society through improving health. And with organ trafficking, when the organ industry is commodified and commercialized, then financial gain of the stakeholders is the primary, or at least a competing interest. And that really impacts the care that people receive, because following up on a donor, even the recipient, once the transaction's completed, it is no longer financially incentivized. So recognizing that this is a global health issue, the WHO in 2004 called on member countries to address this issue of transplant tourism and organ trafficking. And that led to the Transplantation Society and the International Society of Nephrology in 2008 to establish this conference in Istanbul with 78 countries to develop the Declaration of Istanbul. And this was a declaration that really defined a lot of the issues involved in organ trafficking and laid out principles involved in ethical organ transplantation. It was printed in essentially every transplant journal around the world. It was translated in over a dozen languages. And one quote I wanted to share with you is, "The legacy of transplantation is threatened by organ trafficking and transplant tourism. The success of transplant as a life-saving treatment does not require nor justify victimizing the world's poor as a source of organs for the rich." Some principles from the DOI that are outlined is that the optimal care of donors and recipients should be the primary goal of transplant programs. Trafficking of organs should be prohibited and criminalized. The act of donation should be an altruistic one and should be financially neutral. You know, donors can be reimbursed for their transportation or health costs, but overall, the act should be financially neutral. Countries should implement legislation governing recovery of organs. And the overarching long-term goal of the Declaration of Istanbul is that countries should really strive to achieve self-sufficiency in transplant to eliminate the need for organ trafficking in the first place. The Canadian Society of Transplant in 2010 published a paper in Transplantation where they endorsed the Declaration of Istanbul, and they condemned organ trafficking, transplant tourism, and commercialization. In this document, they summarized what the healthcare providers, transplant physicians, fiduciary, and legal obligations are to patients who participate in transplant tourism. So I just want to highlight a typical scenario that we as transplant physicians come across. I probably get 2 or 3 of these scenarios a year. So suppose you have a 45-year-old gentleman, blood group B, end-stage renal disease from glomerulonephritis, who started dialysis about a month ago. Unfortunately, he lives alone. He doesn't have any living donors. And I tell him that his anticipated wait time on dialysis is about 5 to 6 years before he gets a deceased donor kidney. Understandably, he's quite upset and desperate. He goes home, does some research, and on the next clinic visit, he tells me that, Dr. Iqbal, I want to go abroad to get a kidney. I found that I can get one within a month. I need copies of my medical records, tests, and I need you to perform XYZ blood tests on me. So what does the CST guidelines say about this kind of scenario? So it's my job as a transplant physician to counsel patients on the medical dangers and ethical concerns with organ trafficking. We know that there's an increased risk of death, allograft failure, serious infections. I need to tell the patient that in order for you to get this kidney, the organ vendor or seller is often exploited, harmed, or can even be killed to obtain their organ. I need to tell my patient that transplant tourism is illegal in most countries, and I have a responsibility to tell this patient, especially if it'll impact the care that he receives, that I'm morally opposed to organ trafficking and transplant tourism. But when he starts asking for his medical records, that's when the situation gets a little bit dicey. So according to CMA Code of Ethics, Article 9, we do have a responsibility to refuse to participate or support practices violating basic human rights, which I feel organ trafficking does. But Article 37 says that when physicians are requested copies of the patient's medical record, unless compelling reason exists that the information will result in harm, then I need to provide that medical record. So this is a bit of an ethical gray zone. And there was a Supreme Court of Canada ruling that non-disclosure may be warranted if there is real potential harm to the patient or to a third party. Post-transplant, the common scenario is that someone who has already received a transplant abroad is referred to us for follow-up. And this scenario is a little bit tricky because oftentimes we don't know exactly what the circumstances were around that transplant. Was it a situation where the patient paid for an organ? Did they receive a kidney from a second, third degree relative? Which is often the case, or sometimes is shown to be the case in these situations. But our duty in this situation is that we're obliged to provide care to patients in emergent need. In non-emergent situations, we're allowed to defer care to another physician, although I'm not sure if that achieves much. So we really do need to provide care to these patients. There are significant challenges in the post-transplant setting. A lot of the times we don't have a lot of information on the donor, which really handcuffs us if there's a rejection, for example, and we don't have proper tissue typing on the donor. We don't know about surgical complications. And as I mentioned, there's a higher risk for infection and surgical issues. I now want to get into the outcomes of organ trafficking. And first we'll talk about the donors. This is a summary table looking at 3 studies of patients or kidney donors or vendors that sold their kidneys in various countries and their socioeconomic outcomes post nephrectomy. The first study is out of Egypt. This is looking at 142 patients. 78% reported deterioration in their health post nephrectomy. 78% spent all of the money that they received within 5 months. And remember, these patients are people that work hard labor jobs, and 73% reported a weakened ability to perform labor-intensive jobs after nephrectomy. The second study is out of India, looking at 300 patients. And again, most of these patients were living below the poverty line. Almost all of the patients sold their kidney to pay off debts. And most of them actually found a decline in the average family income post-nephrectomy because of a weakened ability to do their job. And the third study is out of Iran, which is a bit of a unique situation. Iran has a regulated system of paid donation, but even in that situation, there were significant negative effects to the donors 65% reported negative effects on their employment status post-nephrectomy. I want to do a bit of a deeper dive into one of the studies. This is looking at kidney vendors in Pakistan. And this was a study of almost 240 patients that sold their kidneys. And a lot can be said about the study, but I just want to highlight a few things. Almost 90% of these people were illiterate. And 66% of these people were bonded labor workers, which is a modern form of slavery. They're working essentially to pay off debts, which might not even be their own. They might be from generations ago. So most of these people were bonded labor workers. And how much did they get offered to sell their kidney? So about 65% were offered up to $2,000. About 35% actually received up to $2,000. So you can see that a lot of them were either lied to or deceived in this transaction. What about the health outcomes? 62% reported that their health was weak post-nephrectomy, and 37% said it was poor. Now, how did they end up selling their kidney? 40% were recruited directly by transplant center staff. 24% were motivated, or I should say coerced by their family in doing so. 19% went directly to the transplant center, and 5% were coerced by landlords. And 85% reported no economic improvement. Either they were still in debt or they were unable to achieve the objectives that they set out to. So that was the economic side. So what about the health outcomes of these kidney vendors? So this was from the same group in Pakistan, which compared kidney vendors to people that underwent kidney donation through a living related program. And you can see that they matched 104 vendors to 184 donors. And post-nephrectomy, they found that the vendors had more hypertension, lower GFR, more proteinuria, and higher rates of Hep B and Hep C. Now, I think there's a number of factors that play. It could be from poor follow-up of these patients, but I think the bigger factor is poor patient selection. For anyone that does donor clinic and donor assessments, it's a very strict and meticulous process, and people have to be almost in perfect health to donate a kidney, and that's to protect the health of the patient post-donation. So, out of every 10 people that want to donate a kidney, only 3 actually are able to do so. But I would imagine that the selection criteria for these people that are selling their kidneys is far less strict because their health is not a concern. What about the recipient side of things? So this was a study out of Toronto, a Canadian study, which looked at 20 commercial transplant recipients, so people that went abroad to buy a kidney. The interesting thing is they all pleaded ignorance regarding the donor selection process. This is something that I wonder about, like how much do the recipients actually know about how they're getting the organ? And anecdotally, I can say that most people, just like this study, plead ignorance. Like, we don't know where the kidney came from. It might be someone who sold their kidney or something like that. Or sometimes, they tell us that it's from a third-degree relative or a cousin or a friend. So that was an interesting point in this study. And they also found that most patients had insufficient documentation of donor information. Over half of patients were medically unstable at the first clinic visit. 38% had pyelonephritis, half of which were from resistant organisms, 14% had TB, and 19% had significant fungal infections. And the hazard ratio for death-censored graft failure was 2.5 at 3 years. And then a follow-up study by the same group in 2016 found that at 8 years, the hazard ratio was 3.69. So again, worse outcomes, more infections, and overall not great at medical outcomes. So the latter part of the study, the presentation, we're going to focus on forced organ harvesting, specifically in China. Just to give you a bit of background on this topic, China has the second largest transplant program in the world. In 1984, China passed legislation to allow organs from executed prisoners. Now, this in and of itself is ethically dubious. There's many concerns. Is someone that's sentenced to death row Are they able to give informed consent free of coercion and manipulation? Were these lawful executions, or were these people that were actually executed for their organs? Was the timing of the execution such that it matched with what the recipients needed? And finally, who are these prisoners? Are these, murderers or people that have committed grave crimes against society, or were these prisoners of conscience? The act of using executed prisoners for donation is universally condemned by the Nuremberg Code, Helsinki Declaration, Istanbul Declaration. And it's important to know that China historically has had very low rates of voluntary organ donation. Several factors, some of those are cultural, but also until 2010, China did not have an organized or voluntary organ donation system at all. So we can see that the rate of voluntary organ donation was quite low. The number of lawfully executed prisoners was nowhere near the amount of transplants that were occurring in China, and was rapidly increasing in the early 2000s. So that led to questions about where these organs are actually coming from. So there were reports from Chinese surgeons that came much later that they were performing forced organ harvesting on Uyghur prisoners as early as the 90s. By the early 2000s, Falun Gong became the primary source of organs, along with other persecuted groups like Tibetans or Christian groups. And then after many, many years of denial, the Chinese health minister in 2005, he confirmed that China was using prisoners for transplant, and they were doing so since the 80s. And up to 95% of transplants in China were from executed prisoners. Although they accepted that they were using prisoners, they never confirmed or acknowledged what kind of prisoners. Were these prisoners of conscience? They never confirmed that they were Falun Gong or Uyghur prisoners. Just to tell you a bit about the Uyghur people, this is a Turkic ethnic group, majority Muslim, native to an area of northwest China known as Xinjiang, and some refer to this area as East Turkestan. Since 2015, millions have been detained in these detention camps, which have been described also as concentration camps, to suppress religion, culture, and enforce upon them the national Chinese ideology. And in many articles, they comment that this is the largest detention this is the largest detention of an ethnic minority since the Holocaust. So quite significant. And there's widespread evidence of torture, forced labor, mass sterilization, surveillance, rape. There was a BBC article about 2 weeks ago of significant amount of rape that's going on in these detention camps, and forced organ harvesting. And it's been declared a genocide by many human rights groups, governments around the world, including the US in January. The Canadian Subcommittee on Human Rights, I believe in October, declared that this is a genocide. And the Canadian Parliament just this week, I believe on Monday, declared that this is in fact a genocide. This is the area of northwest China where the Uyghurs are native to. Who are the Falun Gong practitioners? So this was a spiritual discipline involving meditation and moral philosophy rooted in Buddhist tradition. It was increasing in popularity in the 90s, and by 1998, there were 70 million Falun Gong practitioners, or more than 70 million in China. And this was seen as a threat to the Chinese national ideology, and they launched a campaign to end this practice through detainment and, again, re-education camps, which involved widespread torture, forced labor, and again, forced organ harvesting, with the goal of getting these people to renounce their beliefs and practices. There's been many, many, many investigations and reports into forced organ harvesting in China. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Kilgore-Matus report was one of the earliest investigations to shed light on this issue. That was in 2006. And as I mentioned, David Kilgore and David Matus were nominated for a Nobel Prize for all of their work on this issue. State Organs, which was a book published by David Matus and Torsten Trey in 2012. Investigations by Ethan Gutman, who is an author and investigator who has done also an incredible amount of work on this issue, and he published a book in 2014. There's been a couple of award-winning documentaries, Human Harvest documentary and Hard to Believe documentary in 2014, 2015. And finally, the China Tribunal. which was an independent tribunal initiated by the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, ETAC, which delivered their final judgment in March of 2020. Another organization called Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, DAFO, published a short report just last year in May of 2020. The China Tribunal was an independent tribunal into forced organ harvesting. It was led by Jeffrey Nice, who was the lead prosecutor as well in the Bosnian genocide. And he led this China Tribunal. And one of the quotes from the final report was that the tribunal's members are certain, unanimously and sure beyond reasonable doubt, that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims. They also confirmed that crimes against humanity have been committed against Falun Gong and the Uyghurs. Multiple lines of evidence that were used in the China Tribunal. I won't get into too much detail. I'm sure David will discuss this as well. The rapid growth of transplants since 2000 with no clear organ source. The wait time for organs in China is exceedingly low compared to the rest of the world, indicating that there's an on-demand reserve for organs available for wealthy tourists who are looking for one. Vulnerability of these imprisoned groups like the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs, who are receiving these quote unquote health checks where they're forced to undergo HLA tissue typing, which is a very specific organ transplant test that's not part of any routine health check. Organ imaging as well, recorded phone calls to hospitals confirming the use of Falun Gong prisoner organs, testimony, multiple lines of testimony, and also commercial incentives as well. So once this came to light, there was international condemnation from governments, human rights organizations, all focus on medical associations and what's been published in the medical literature. So the Transplantation Society, TTS, was the first organization, the transplant organization, to publish a policy on interactions with China in 2006. The World Medical Association in 2006 demanded that China should stop using prisoner organs, and the Lancet in 2011 called for a complete boycott of Chinese research pertaining to transplant. Let's take a sip of water. This was a very powerful editorial published in AJT in 2011, and I'll share a quote from that. As history has painfully taught us, in face of a self-admitted crime against humanity, it is our moral obligation as individuals and a community to raise our voices and do our utmost to bring the process to a complete halt. If another 18,000 executed prisoners with, air quotes, severe brain injury in all cases become organ donors in China, and we have not done our utmost to put an end to this practice, we will all have blood on our hands. And the AJT article recommended the following steps: that medical societies should not accept research or accept memberships from Chinese centers unless they demonstrate clearly that executed prisoners were not used. Pharmaceutical companies should ensure that no transplant studies use executed prisoners. And training of Chinese transplant doctors should be conditional based on acceptance that this is an unethical practice that they condemn. So in response to all this international pressure, China vowed to end this practice and to move to a voluntary donation system and officially abolish this practice by 2015. They apparently made a lot of positive changes, including developing a national organ allocation system called COTRS. They developed clear definitions for circulatory and neurological death, and they developed a network of organ procurement organizations, or OPOs. So according to COTRS data from 2010 to 2018, voluntary deceased donor kidneys increased by 185 times, and voluntary liver transplants increased by 166 times, a huge rise over the course of 8 years. And these changes were applauded by the international medical community. But there were still concerns and suspicion because there was little transparency in the transplant data. The data sets were not publicly available. They required manual collection from state-run Chinese publications. So this was a landmark paper published in 2019 in BMC Medical Ethics. They looked to see whether this transplant data set from China, these data sets were transparent, whether there was integrity and consistency in the data. They used statistical methods to analyze national provincial data sets to look for coherence, consistency, and any evidence of manipulation. So it was a very long study. I won't get into all the details, partly because I don't understand all of them, but I'll focus on a few things here. From 2010 to 2016, the increase in deceased donor voluntary transplants went from 33 to 7224. Liver transplants went from 30 to 3257. Just a huge exponential rise in voluntary kidney and liver donation. Okay, the authors of this study used something called an R squared, which is a statistic that measures closeness of fit. They used this and modeled that growth in transplant to a quadratic function to see how predictable this data was. And they found that the R squared was 0.9993 and 0.9995 for kidneys and liver donors respectively. And again, the closer you are to 1, that means there's so little variability in the data that it completely matches this quadratic function. And the same tests were applied to 50 other countries. And, you know, as you would expect in a natural occurring data set, there was significant expected variation from that quadratic function. So the COTRS data set seemed like complete smoke and mirrors, and there's no reason that the growth of a large, complex, geographically scattered transplant program would adhere so closely to a simple mathematical function. The authors also found contradictory, implausible, or anomalous data artifacts in 5 provincial data sets, suggesting manipulation to enforce conformity with central quotas. The author said the only plausible explanation is systematic falsification and manipulation of these organ transplant data sets. And they said that these findings are relevant for international interaction with Chinese organ transplant programs. Another very landmark groundbreaking paper published in BMJ 2 years ago, this looked at Chinese transplant research that was published in English medical journals from 2000 to 2017 to see if the English publications actually adhere to the ethical standards that they set out to. They found 445 studies. They said 92% did not report if organs were sourced from executed prisoners. 99% failed to report on consent. And the authors of this paper said that the research community has failed in implementing the standards that were previously established and raised issue of complicity in these practices. And they called for retraction of these papers. And in response to this, among many other journals to retract papers, Transplantation retracted 7 articles identified as breaching ethical guidelines. I'm almost done, but I just want to share some more concerning Chinese donor data. This was a letter to the editor in Transplant International in 2020. They were looking specifically at one study from a Chinese transplant center where the letter to the editor said that the mean age in this study was 39 years for DCD donors, and that's donation after cardiac death, and 35 years for donation after brain death donors. Just to give you an idea, the mean age DCD donors in Canada is 53 years. So the question is, how are all these 30-year-old people dying in China of natural brain and cardiac deaths? And the mean warm ischemic time is 5 minutes in these studies in DCD donors, and only 0.3% had a warm ischemic time of greater than 30 minutes. And in Canada, 53% of DCD donors have a warm ischemic time greater than 30 minutes. And just to explain, the warm ischemic time is the time from withdrawal of life support to the time the organ is put into a cold solution. So that includes the dying process, the process of procuring the organ, and the process of putting it on a cold pump. So it's impossible that this time could be 5 minutes. And the question is, how are these statistics possible with natural deaths? So unfortunately, it seems like there's not much transplant reform, and it's actually business as usual. About 2 million Uyghurs have been detained in these detention camps. Millions have been forced to undergo medical testing, and these falsified donor data with increased transplant rates suggest that this practice continues. And this is just my last slide. What can we as transplant professionals, from my perspective, do about this issue? We can learn about it and spread awareness. It's our role to, condemn this practice, just as we would have condemned the Nazi doctors in the Holocaust or the Soviet psychiatrists in the 60s. We need to condemn what's happening in China and forced organ harvesting in China. We need to educate our patients and deter them from transplant tourism. We need to push our government to strengthen laws about organ trafficking. We need to support organizations like Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, ETAC, who are working on this issue. And we need to urge our professional societies and institutions to condemn this practice and develop policies to combat it. So I'm going to end there. And I'm going to introduce David. I said a few words about David at the beginning of my talk, but just to remind you, David Kilgore is a lawyer, researcher, investigator. He's an author. He was a member of parliament from 1979 to 2006, representing Southeast Edmonton. He's former Secretary of State for Asia Pacific in 2002, 2003. He's much more qualified to talk about this than I am. So I'm going to give him the floor, and hopefully we'll have some Q&A afterwards. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Ali. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Or you can hear, can you? Well, listen, you have said so much, and you've said it so well. I could just say, and it's true, I agree with everything you've said and support enthusiastically what you've said. I'll try not to repeat anything you've said, and I can send this text I prepared to you if you think anybody there listening early in the morning would want to see it. Incidentally, we had a conference yesterday in Australia, and we had 26 countries represented, 11 universities, I believe, all kinds of amazing people like yourselves that were there, and it was a fascinating conference. I wish you could all have been there, because I think you would have found it really interesting. Let me just pick up on a couple of things to start with. The way it works, and by the way, a number of hospitals, I can't say Canada specifically, but I'm pretty sure Canada is one of them, have brokers going through the hospitals, going to patients and saying, would you like an organ? And I believe that's the way a number of people are recruited to go to China for organs. So you might keep an eye on this at St. Joseph's if you have any suspicious looking people wandering around some of the more obvious wards. And the way it works is that the arrangement's made with a broker, huge prices, as some of your charts have shown, and the patient who's desperate, we're all trying to save lives. We're not trying to make life miserable for somebody who's got a severe heart problem. But what they do is they send the money through a broker. They then fly probably to Shanghai, or a lot of them, Canadians go to, or people from the West, I should put it, go to Shanghai, to the #1 People's Hospital in Shanghai. And they check in, and a doctor comes and examines them for tissue type and the kinds of things that you all know much better than I do. And they then go on a computer bank, and they go out to, at one point we thought about 350 forced labor camps across China. Now, of course, we're hearing a great deal about the forced labor camps in the East Turkestan part of Xinjiang. And the people who are working 16 hours a day in these camps, and by the way, we've talked to some of the people who got out of these camps and managed to get to other countries where we were able to speak to them. They're examined every 3 months. Doctors come into these work camps, and they describe to us the kind of examinations they get. They look in their eyes, all kinds of things, but it's not to see whether they're healthy or not, because as they say, they're being tortured and they're working 16 hours a day with terrible food and so on. They're being examined to see what kind of organ donors they would be. So then when the computer bank says that there's a match for Miss Smith out in work camp number 400 or 200, the poor donor is literally taken out of the dormitory in the middle of the night. We've heard of accounts of this, has all their organs taken out, by the way. They don't just take the heart or the lung or the one that's sought. They take all the organs. Most of them are wasted, as you can all understand, because of the delays in finding someone who needs a particular organ. The organ is flown to Shanghai from one of these camps in the peripheral regions of China and transplanted. And then the person comes back to, let's say, Hamilton or Ottawa. And then we get into the transplant post-treatment problems that you were speaking about, Ali. But it's, in fact, it's the first point I make in this paper is that if there are about 200 independent countries today in the world, there's only one of them, to our knowledge, that has an organ transplant system that's run by the government rather than as a criminal offense done by unscrupulous surgeons. You mentioned 3 countries, Egypt and India. I know that some doctors in India have gone to jail for doing these operations. So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the only place where it's legal is in China, and it's run. The whole system is run by the government, and of course hospitals and doctors and pilots and brokers and all the people who participate in the system. In fact, David Matus points out that they finance their whole medical system out of the profits they make from the organ transplants. Anyway, David Matus and I, as volunteers, did a study, and we were, as you mentioned, I think, Ali, we did 2 reports and a book. Ethan Gutman, who spent 7 years researching his book, The Slaughter, which you mentioned. He put the persecution of Falun Gong, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and the Christian communities in context. Gutman explained his best estimate that the organs of 65,000 Falun Gong and 2,000 to 4,000, in quotes, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Christians were pillaged in the 2000-2008 period. Now, in fact, this organ harvesting first began in the Uyghur community, and there's one of your colleagues, Dr. Enver Toti, who's an amazing human being. He lives in London now. He was a surgeon in Urumqi, and in '95, as I think you mentioned, Ali, he was sent to an execution ground where, as he says to his horror, they actually shot the person to be executed. And let me add that the last time I looked, there were 57 offenses in China that can get you capital punishment. It's true that the number has gone down, thank goodness, but you can be executed for just about anything, including income tax fraud, by the way, in China. Anyway, this poor man had been shot in the right side of his chest, and poor Enver had to take the organs out, his heart out of the left side, of course. And so it really, the first case we know of started in amongst the Uyghur community. It's, let me try to shorten this up. Yeah, the independent tribunal headed by Sir Geoffrey Nice, and Geoffrey Nice was at the conference yesterday too, out of Australia. They listened to 54 witnesses on the persecution of Falun Gong, and they came to a unanimous judgment. I think you mentioned this. They pointed out that they got no cooperation from the government of China, but they tried not to use that either for or against. But they found that there was overwhelming evidence, and they reached a unanimous damning verdict. And their final report, by the way, is 608 pages. So you can read that while you're having coffee someday on your rounds. The tribunal concluded that Falun Gong members were the primary victims of the harvest, but since 2017, as I think you mentioned, there's been a comprehensive DNA collection of every man, woman, and child from Xinjiang's Uyghur community. With about up to estimates of 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, this is added to the concern that Sir Geoffrey talks about, that Uyghurs are now the main body. And in fact, he's now doing a study of how the Uyghurs might be the main source of victims now in China. They came to the, and I think you referred to this too, an incomprehensible gap leading to the conclusion that there must have existed another source or sources of organs. And the tribunal, as I mentioned, was unanimous. Now, this is interesting. John Chisholm, who's the head of the British Medical Association's Ethics Committee, stated, quote, "The practice of forced organ harvesting represents a gross and continuing violation of a series of inalienable fundamental human rights, including the right to life, and in some cases, the right to be free from torture or from cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment." The BNA, British Medical Association, called on the People's Republic of China to do an independent investigation. And I'm sorry to say, you can be absolutely certain that they will not do that, in my experience with them for many years. And as you mentioned, Ali, this recent broadcast on the BBC World Service, it was also on CNN, seems to have had a major effect on public opinion across the world, certainly I think in Canada, Britain. This was what the two Uyghur women described hideous rape and torture that women go through in these so-called re-education camps. I have a link to the broadcast if you want to see it. Now, I'll keep this part short. Radio Free Asia has reported that a hospital for infectious diseases in Aksu City in Xinjiang was transformed into a second internment camp. And there's also a large crematorium nearby. Ethan Gutman yesterday talked about 9 crematoriums that have been built in Xinjiang. And there's also a particular aisle at the airport, Urumqi, where you can, for organ transplants, you get preferred treatment. And there's a sign on the wall saying this. Some of you may have heard about it. It's been quite a thing on the social media. But I think I can. Yeah, Ethan has estimated that human body in Xinjiang in these camps could be worth up to $750,000 for their lungs, hearts, kidney, and so on. And to Ethan Gutman's enormous credit, he's continuing to do research on in the Stan regions of Central Asia, talking to people who've been exposed to the kinds of things we're talking about here. I'm oh yes, this is interesting. Dr. Maya Mitalapova of MIT's Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, and I'm quoting her here, quote, "The entire population of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in Xinjiang has been forcefully health checked, and blood samples have been withdrawn. From 2016 on, these procedures were performed only on the Muslim population," close quote. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has termed Xinjiang a no-rights zone, encircled by barbed wire, surveillance cameras, and armed guards. Are labor camps where Turkic minorities are forced to work for little or no pay. Now, finally, a tiny bit of good news, which you mentioned too, Ali, is that the House of Commons voted 266 to 0 the other day that the party state in China is committing genocide against the Muslim minority. And a friend of mine who's a Uyghur Canadian, when she heard this news, she burst into tears. She was so proud of Canada. And I think it's really a major accomplishment. By the way, the motion also talked about moving the Olympic Games from Beijing in 2022 to some other city. Some of you may be too young to know that in 2008, the government of China got the Games promising to treat human rights better. And I think it's fair to say that human rights have got significantly worse since 2008. So maybe there'll be some comments about what we should do about the Games. So in call to actions, I guess, please, all of you consider joining DAFO. I'm sure Ali can give you the website for Torsten Trey, and he'd be delighted to have any of you join the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. We'd all be delighted to have you join ITEC too, and that's pretty. You can find the email for that. If you simply go David Kilgore and Google, it'll come up very quickly on my website. Maybe Ali has it already. Yeah, no, I think I'll leave some of the recommendations because they're obvious. Canada should apply its Magnitsky laws and other targeted sanctions against any Chinese government official known to be involved in organ harvesting. If we and other democracies show more commitment to our own values, the despicable commerce in organs might soon end in China. And finally, as I would say, to repeat, please consider joining DAFO and/or ETAC. We would love to. We'd love to have you. We'll stop there, Ali.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate you being here and your comments.
How did you manage to learn so much about this? I thought you doctors never had any spare time.
There's a lot of resources. ETAC was a big source, and
Good. Wonderful to hear.
Oh, thanks, Ali and David. It's David's Alistair Ingram here. I'm the Chief of Medicine here at St. Joe's. We have a few questions.
Sure.
Just before we take questions, I'll put in a short plug for a website that I've used for some time called notmadeinchina.directory. You can enter the product you're interested in buying and find options that have no components from China. I've been doing that. I've been doing that for some time, with the one exception of my Apple cell phone. I'll be buying a Samsung cell phone next time based on what I have from that website.
I have a Samsung. They're much better. They're much better.
Yeah, they're much better in many ways, I think, David. We have a couple of questions here. Ali, Mitch Levine has said, am I correct that you presented data with a hazard ratio of greater than 3 for mortality with transplant tourism? And he asked if the recipients knew their prognosis is actually worse than continuing on dialysis and waiting for a legitimate transplant. He would have thought this would curtail the practice. What do you think? How would you comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. That's something that we have to definitely counsel the patients on, that are considering transplant tourism and organ trafficking, and we should tell them that, you know, not only do you have a higher risk of infection, not only is this ethically wrong, but you have a worse outcome compared to getting a transplant locally. The issue is that these are just broad kind of general hazard ratio for anyone that goes abroad for a kidney transplant. But I would imagine that it's center specific. If you go to Egypt for a kidney, the outcome might be different compared to going to China, compared to going to India. So we quote these numbers and we tell patients, and you know, the better we counsel patients on this, then it should curtail the practice. But sometimes patients are so desperate to get off dialysis, they ignore a lot of those counseling. They just can't imagine the idea of being on dialysis for 5 years. So in that desperation, they would take possibly a worse outcome in order to get off dialysis.
Yeah, I would echo that. I've had 3 patients from my practice over 25 years that have gone abroad, 2 of whom subsequently died from horrible fungal infections. But they all 3 had an extraordinarily negative attitude towards dialysis. Dialysis is not positive, but you do get these individuals who just cannot conceive of staying on dialysis. Couple other questions. We had a hand raise here as well. I will try to see if the hand raise is still up. There, here we go. So we have, I think, the hand raise. Yeah, so Farouk, did you want to ask a question? I think I've unmuted, asked to unmute. This is, okay, Farouk, maybe if you could just type your question, perhaps, might be better. We have a question from Dr. Rabat. Is it still justifiable for recipients to plead ignorance about the source of their transplanted organs? Given these atrocities, isn't it time for programs and systems to decline to provide care for those returning home from organs from abroad?
Is that Ali, that question? Or to...
Yes, that's the question. What about, so Ali went through this briefly, so what about a harder line on declining to provide care when patients come home?
I think that's tough. In the post-transplant setting, it's tough to just say that we won't provide care, especially, you know, in the emergent setting. I don't think there's many scenarios at all where you can where you can say that that we're not going to provide emergent care to you, even though they might have done something that's morally objectionable. Like even people that have committed grave crimes against society, murderers, rapists, they still receive medical care. So I don't think we can say that we're not going to treat you. I think more should be focused on pre-transplant counseling to deter them from going there in the first place. And I think that's where the focus should be, and there should be more, awareness campaigns for patients to know what's going on. And David.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Ali? David Matus and I have been in something like 50 countries talking about this. And I remember going to Australia.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Sorry?
Sorry, it's just the hospital PA system, David, sorry.
Yeah, the deputy minister of health in one of the provinces there, maybe I better not identify the province, told us off the record that people from Australia had stopped going to China for organs because thanks to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, they put so much on the news about this, what we've been talking about, and where the organs, how they are taken in China, that Australians had simply stopped going to get organs there, even people who needed them desperately. Now, I like to think that if Canadians knew where the organs were coming from and somebody was being murdered on demand, that they would stop going too. Now, maybe I'm being naive about that, but I wish if we could get it better known across the country as to what's happening in China, that I think a lot, and of course we don't know exactly how many Canadians are going. I know I'm sure it's a small number, but there are Canadians, I believe, that are still going to China for organs. And
just to add to that, David, other countries like, for example, Taiwan has, and Israel actually, one of the leads for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, Dr. Lavi, is out of Israel, and he had a huge public awareness campaign about what's happening in China. And since, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years, they haven't had a single patient go to China for an organ transplant. So it is effective. So we just need to increase awareness. And
Maureen Mead, one of our ICU docs at HHS, has made a similar comment. An alternative to refusing care would be to provide care only if the patient will watch a presentation such as this prior to going abroad to try to seek an organ.
Yes. Yeah.
So I would like to thank Ali for an excellent talk, and thank David for his comments, and also for really his lifetime of advocacy on this issue. It's sort of been, as a nephrologist, an issue that sort of burns in the background for us, but certainly I think that this talk and what is happening in China, really we need to focus on this, and as a group make every possible effort to discourage our patients from being any part of this. And I would like to give one more plug for notmadeinchina.directory as well. So I wish everybody a great day. Thanks again to Ali, and particularly David. I think it's early out where you are.
No. Thank you so much for doing this. I can't
really
thank you all enough.
Really appreciate you joining us, and thanks once again from the medical community for all your advocacy.
Thanks, Ken.
Take care, everybody.